The courthouse was filled with tension. It was early in the morning, and the air was thick with anticipation. Chris, a quiet man in his 30s, stood nervously at the front of the courtroom. He was dressed in a simple black suit, looking out of place among the sharply dressed lawyers and the people sitting in the gallery. He had always kept to himself, never the type to attract attention. But today, he was the center of it all. His entire future rested on the words that would be spoken here today. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Chris had been living a peaceful life, working as a mechanic, doing the best he could to get by. He wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble had found him. It all started when he had been wrongfully accused of a crime he didn't commit. A traffic stop had escalated into something much worse, a false accusation that he had assaulted a police officer during the stop. It was a lie, but the system didn't seem to care. They had their story, and Chris was the one who had to prove he was innocent. As the judge entered the courtroom, everyone stood in respect. Chris felt the weight of his situation press down on him. His hands were trembling, and he forced himself to breathe deeply. His eyes briefly met the gaze of the officer who had arrested him, a tall man with an air of arrogance that Chris couldn't stand. Officer Daniels. The man had given his testimony just moments earlier, painting Chris as a violent criminal. It wasn't true, but no one seemed to care. Chris could hear his heartbeat in his ears as the courtroom quieted. The judge sat down, adjusting his glasses and glancing over the documents in front of him. The trial was supposed to be a formality, an easy win for the prosecution. But Chris wasn't going to let that happen. He had something they didn't expect. He had the truth on his side, and he wasn't afraid to speak up. As the officer's testimony wrapped up, the tension in the room was palpable. Chris was the next to speak. His lawyer, a tall woman with sharp features, gave him a nod of encouragement. But Chris barely noticed. His mind was focused on one thing. He needed to tell his side of the story, and he needed to do it now. He rose from his seat slowly, his legs feeling heavier than ever before. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him. Some were skeptical, others disinterested, but none of that mattered. Chris had waited too long to back down now. The judge motioned for him to begin. "Mr. Dawson, you may speak." Chris took a deep breath, looking around the courtroom. He knew that what he was about to say would change everything. His lawyer had told him to be calm, to present his case logically. But Chris wasn't interested in following the usual rules. He was tired of being pushed around, tired of being made to look guilty when he wasn't. He had nothing to hide, and he wasn't going to let anyone think otherwise. "I wasn't the one who caused trouble that day," Chris began, his voice steady but strong. "I didn't assault anyone. I was just doing my job, driving home from work. I've never been in trouble with the law. But Officer Daniels, he was looking for a reason to arrest me. He found one, even though it wasn't true." The room was silent. Chris's words had the power to stop the entire trial in its tracks. He could see the judge's eyes narrow as he listened carefully. The officer who had arrested him shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening. The room was waiting for Chris to say more. He continued, "The officer pulled me over for no reason. I did everything he told me to do. I even showed him my license and registration. But he wasn't satisfied. He started asking me questions that didn't make sense, then accused me of being rude. I wasn't rude. I was just trying to understand what was happening. But he decided to take matters into his own hands." Chris paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He was nervous, but something inside of him told him to keep going. He couldn't stop now. "I was scared," Chris admitted, looking directly at the judge. "I've never been arrested before. I didn't know what was going to happen, but I did what I had to do to stay safe. And now I'm here, trying to defend myself against something that never should have happened." The judge looked at Chris for a long moment, his face unreadable. The officers in the room exchanged glances, and the room was filled with an air of confusion. Chris had just laid out his version of the events. The officer who had arrested him was the only one left to speak, but the damage had already been done. Chris had shown that he wasn't the one at fault. He was the victim here. Just as the judge was about to ask Officer Daniels to speak, Chris stood up, his eyes locked on the officer. He knew that it was time to reveal the truth. This wasn't just about the arrest. There was something bigger at play here, something the officer didn't expect Chris to know. "I'm not just some man you can push around," Chris said, his voice rising. "I know things, and I'm going to make sure you understand exactly what you did that day." The room went silent. Everyone looked at Chris, waiting for him to explain. What did he know? How could he possibly know something that would make Officer Daniels nervous? And that was when Chris pointed at the officer. His fingers trembling with the weight of his words, he spoke the truth that no one in the room saw coming. "You said." The tension in the courtroom thickened. The judge, who had been calm up until this point, now seemed to shift in his seat, his hands tightening around the gavel. The eyes of everyone in the room were locked on Chris. His bold statement had caught them all off guard. The officer, Daniels, looked uneasy for the first time since the trial began. His eyes flickered nervously as Chris's finger pointed directly at him. "I know what you did, Daniels," Chris continued, his voice steady and clear. "You don't just pick on anyone. You've done this before, targeting people, looking for an excuse to arrest them. But I'm not just anyone, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." The courtroom was still. No one spoke. Even the officers in the back of the room, who had been watching the trial closely, held their breath. It wasn't often that someone dared to speak out like this, especially against a cop. They were trained to believe the police in situations like this. But Chris wasn't backing down. Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly taken aback. He opened his mouth to respond, but Chris didn't give him the chance. The words that Chris was about to say would change everything. "You don't know who I am, do you?" Chris's eyes bore into Officer Daniels, his fingers still pointing at him. "I wasn't just some man you picked out of a crowd. I didn't tell you everything about myself before, but now I will." Chris paused, letting the silence stretch in the room. It felt like an eternity as the judge and everyone else in the courtroom waited for Chris to continue. Daniels looked like he wanted to speak, but he couldn't. It was as if the words were stuck in his throat. "You think I'm just a mechanic, right?" Chris said slowly, allowing his words to sink in. "But I'm not. I'm much more than that. I've been trained to fight, trained to lead. I served in Delta Force. I've seen things that you wouldn't even believe. And trust me, I know how to handle people who try to bully others." The room was in shock. The words that Chris had just spoken were like a thunderclap. Delta Force, the elite military unit that only the most highly trained soldiers could ever hope to join. It sounded unbelievable, yet there was something in Chris's voice that made everyone listen. Officer Daniels' face drained of color. His arrogance, which had been so evident just moments ago, was now replaced with fear. He had no idea who Chris really was. If he had known, he would never have treated him the way he had. But now, it was too late. Chris had already exposed him. The judge, who had been silent throughout this exchange, cleared his throat. "Mr. Dawson," he said, his voice firm but respectful, "if what you are saying is true, this changes the entire nature of this case." Chris nodded. "It does. But what's even worse is that Daniels never even bothered to ask. He assumed I was just some man in a wheelchair, easy to intimidate. He didn't see me for who I really was." There was an edge to Chris's voice now, a kind of quiet fury that simmered beneath the surface. The room, which had been silent, now buzzed with whispers. People were trying to process what they had just heard. Was this really the same man who had been arrested for a simple traffic stop? Chris's lawyer stood up from her seat, her eyes wide with surprise. She had known about his past, of course, but she hadn't expected him to reveal it in such a dramatic fashion. She could see that Chris had made a calculated decision. He wasn't just defending himself. He was about to expose the truth in a way no one could ignore. Daniels finally managed to speak, though his voice was shaking. "This is ridiculous. This doesn't change anything. You're just trying to make it look like I did something wrong." Chris didn't flinch. "No, Daniels, I'm not trying to make anything look like anything. You did something wrong. And now everyone in this courtroom is going to know what kind of person you are." The judge leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Officer Daniels, I think we need to pause this trial. It seems we need to reconsider some things." His words echoed in the room. It was clear that he wasn't about to let the trial continue until the truth was fully addressed. Chris's lawyer took a step forward. "Your Honor, I believe it's time to review the officer's conduct and consider whether his actions were in line with proper procedures." Daniel stood up quickly, trying to defend himself, but the judge raised his hand to silence him. "I think you should step down, Officer Daniels. This is no longer just about the traffic stop. We need to take a serious look at what's been happening here." There was a shift in the atmosphere. The power had shifted. Chris wasn't just a man in a wheelchair anymore. He was someone who had the strength to change the course of his own fate. He had fought for his dignity, and now the courtroom was forced to listen. The truth had been laid bare, and the people who had assumed they were in control were suddenly on the defensive. As Daniels reluctantly stepped back, the judge called for a brief recess. The courtroom erupted into quiet chatter as the officers, the lawyer, and everyone else began to process what had just transpired. Chris stood tall, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. He had fought for his truth, and now he had the upper hand. He knew this was just the beginning. There would be more battles to fight, more truths to reveal, but for now he had won. And that was all that mattered. "You said." The courtroom was buzzing with energy as the judge called for a recess. It was as though the very air had changed, thick with tension and disbelief. The whispers that swirled around the room spoke of surprise and shock. Everyone, from the jury to the other officers, was now reevaluating everything they had thought they knew about Chris. No one had expected a simple traffic stop to spiral into a revelation of military background, of Delta Force, and a man who had been underestimated at every turn. As the recess continued, Chris remained seated, his gaze fixed ahead. He didn't smile, didn't even shift his posture. Inside, however, a sense of victory settled over him. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about reclaiming his dignity and showing the world that appearances could be deceiving. Across the room, Officer Daniels stood with his back against the wall, nervously speaking with his lawyer. His usual confidence had evaporated. He had been in the force for years, seen countless arrests, and always thought of himself as a man in control. But now, facing the realization that Chris was no ordinary man, Daniels struggled to hold himself together. The judge, meanwhile, was in his chambers, having a private discussion with the prosecutor and Chris's lawyer. The gravity of what had just been revealed had thrown everything into question. They needed to reassess the case, perhaps even reconsider Daniels' conduct and the events leading up to the arrest. In the back of his mind, the judge knew something had gone horribly wrong when Daniels decided to arrest Chris. The behavior didn't line up with what the law required. The fact that Chris had been treated as less than human, the fact that Daniels had ignored him and jumped to conclusions, had now been exposed for all to see. Chris's lawyer, a calm, composed woman named Emily, had been silent during the commotion. She had known that Chris's background was more complicated than what he had shared, but even she hadn't anticipated such a dramatic turn of events. Emily had seen many trials in her career, but nothing quite like this, and while she was well aware that the truth was now on the table, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that things could still go awry. The courtroom was unpredictable, and powerful people often had a way of bending the rules. As the recess came to an end, the judge returned to his seat, his face grave. Everyone stood as he entered, the room falling into an expectant silence. The judge raised his gavel, signaling the trial's continuation. "Officer Daniels," the judge began, his voice steady, I'm ordering a full review of the actions leading up to the arrest of Mr. Dawson. This case is no longer just about the arrest. It's about how the law was applied. You may step down." The officer's shoulders slumped. His usual demeanor was gone, replaced by a look of defeat. He didn't argue. He simply nodded and retreated from the witness stand. The shift in power was palpable. The judge's words had placed Daniels in a vulnerable position, one that he could not escape. Chris's lawyer stood, ready to speak, but she was interrupted by the judge's voice once again. "Mr. Dawson," the judge called, "would you like to speak again?" Chris stood without hesitation, his voice strong and sure. "Yes, Your Honor. Thank you for hearing me." The courtroom was once again locked on him. And for the first time, Chris felt the weight of all their eyes on him. Not in judgment, but in recognition. They were no longer seeing the man in the wheelchair, the victim of a wrongful arrest. They were seeing the man who had fought back, the man who had forced them to acknowledge his strength and his past. "I know there are many who believe that I should have kept quiet," Chris continued, his words deliberate. "That I should have just let this go, taken the punishment, and moved on. But I couldn't. You see, for years I've been told I don't matter. I've been overlooked, treated as less than. But I'm not just a victim. I'm a survivor. And I'll fight for what's right, no matter who stands in my way." His voice grew stronger with each sentence, and there was a quiet power in his words. He wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for every person who had been ignored, dismissed, or made to feel small. His message wasn't just about this case. It was about the broader injustice that still plagued society. Emily, watching him with admiration, realized that this trial had become something bigger than they had planned. Chris had tapped into something that resonated with people, a desire for fairness, respect, and equality. And whether they won the case or not, Chris had already made his mark. The judge, having listened intently, nodded in acknowledgement. "Your words are noted, Mr. Dawson," he said. "I believe it's time for us to proceed with a more thorough investigation into the events surrounding this case." Chris took his seat again, feeling the weight of his words settle in the room. The judge's decision was just the beginning. The real work was only starting now. The courtroom may have been silent, but outside, the ripple effect of his actions was already spreading. People would talk. They would discuss what had happened, how Chris had turned the tables, how he had challenged the very system that tried to oppress him. As the trial resumed, Chris knew this was his moment. The fight wasn't over, but he had already won something far more important than a verdict. He had taken control of his story, and no one would ever see him as weak or powerless again. The ripple effect of Chris's bravery began to spread, not just through the courtroom, but to everyone who heard his story. What had seemed like a small, isolated incident had now become a battle for something far greater: justice, dignity, and respect for every person who had ever been treated as less than they were. "You said." The courtroom was filled with tension as the trial continued. Chris sat at the defendant's table, his eyes unwavering, as if daring anyone to question him. Officer Daniels had stepped down, and now it was Chris's turn to speak again. The air was thick with anticipation, and the hum of whispered conversations grew louder with each passing second. Every person in that room was waiting for the next revelation, for the final pieces to fall into place. Chris had already spoken his truth, but the real story was yet to be told. He was not just the man in the wheelchair, not just the victim of a mistake. He was something far more formidable. He had lived through battles, both on and off the field, and now the whole world was about to understand that. Emily, his lawyer, had seen many cases in her career, but none like this one. She had believed in Chris from the start, but even she could not have predicted the way things had unfolded. It wasn't just about the wrong arrest anymore. It was about standing up for every person who had been unjustly judged, misunderstood, and cast aside. "Your Honor," Emily began, standing before the judge, "we have gathered new evidence that shows not only the unlawful actions of Officer Daniels, but also the long-standing pattern of discrimination in the handling of people like Mr. Dawson. He is not just a victim of a single injustice. He is a symbol of many who have faced systemic oppression. The judge nodded slowly, clearly acknowledging the gravity of her words. He was no longer the impartial observer he had once been. As a man who had witnessed many trials, he knew when something bigger was at play. This wasn't just a case of an arrest gone wrong. This was a case about systemic flaws that needed to be addressed, whether in law enforcement, the judicial system, or society as a whole. Chris sat back, letting the words hang in the air. He had been in situations where the odds were stacked against him. He had learned to silence the doubt and the fear, and now he was doing it again. The fight was no longer just for justice. It was for awareness, for change. Chris wasn't going to let this moment pass quietly into the night. "Your Honor," Emily continued, her voice calm but forceful, "Mr. Dawson's record is impeccable. He is a man who has served his country with honor, a man who has fought for the freedom of others. And yet, because of his appearance, he has been reduced to a stereotype, judged not by his actions but by the way he looks. This is unacceptable." The words hit like a hammer. The courtroom was silent, but the weight of her statement reverberated through the room. It wasn't just the judge who was thinking deeply. The jury, the prosecutor, and even the defense attorney were now reflecting on the larger implications of Chris's situation. It was a moment of reckoning, a moment when the veil of ignorance started to lift. "Your Honor," Chris spoke up, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "I've spent my life being told that I wasn't enough. That because of my background, my race, my wheelchair, I didn't have a place in the world. But I'm here to tell you, I've earned my place. I didn't choose this path, but I walked it. And I'm not going to let anyone erase my story." The room grew still, and it was almost as if the world outside had stopped for a brief moment. The judge looked over at Chris, his eyes softening. He could see it now. The quiet strength, the unshakable resolve of a man who had been through hell and back and wasn't going to let anyone define him. The trial was no longer just about a wrongful arrest. It was about so much more than that. "Mr. Dawson," the judge finally spoke, his voice echoing in the room, "we will proceed with further investigation into the behavior of Officer Daniels. Based on the evidence presented, we will also look into the broader practices within this department. What has been uncovered today is troubling, and it cannot go unchecked." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and Chris felt a small sense of relief, but he knew the battle was far from over. This was just one small victory. The real fight would be in the days that followed, in the changes that needed to come not just to this case, but to the system as a whole. As the judge's words sank in, the door to the courtroom opened, and a few reporters filed in. They had been waiting outside, eager to cover the case that had taken an unexpected turn. The trial had become a sensation, not because of the arrest, but because of Chris's unflinching stance. His story was resonating with people, his courage, his voice, his determination to make a difference. It was a story that was bigger than this courtroom. It was a story that was about the fight for justice, for equality, and for the dignity of every person who had been overlooked or cast aside. The judge stood, signaling the end of the day's proceedings. "We will reconvene tomorrow for further testimony. Mr. Dawson, we thank you for your patience and your courage. You have made your case clear, and the court will give it the consideration it deserves." Chris stood up, his wheelchair moving silently across the floor. Emily was at his side, but it wasn't just the lawyer who had helped him. Chris had helped himself, by standing tall, by speaking his truth, by refusing to back down. He had sent a message not just to the judge, the jury, and the officers in the room, but to the world. As they left the courtroom, Chris felt a sense of peace settle over him. The journey wasn't over, but he had already made an impact. The power of his story, the strength in his words, had reached far beyond the walls of the courtroom. And no matter the verdict, he had already won. He had proven that even when the world tried to silence you, you could still make yourself heard. And now, the world was listening. You said. The courtroom was now empty, save for a few lingering people who were wrapping up their notes and papers. Chris was wheeling his way toward the exit with Emily close by, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Despite the progress they had made, he knew the hardest part was yet to come. As they reached the door, Emily turned to him, her face tired but full of admiration. You did it, Chris. You made them listen. That was incredible. Chris looked at her with a faint smile, but his eyes were distant. I've been waiting a long time to be heard. But this fight isn't just mine anymore. It's for everyone who's been told they don't matter. Before Emily could respond, a voice from behind them called out, Mr. Dawson. Chris turned to see a man in a suit walking toward him, his expression serious, but with a glimmer of something else behind his eyes. Something like respect. Yes, Chris asked, his curiosity piqued. The man held out a business card. I'm Detective Harris. I'm with the Internal Affairs Division. We've been monitoring this case closely. After today's testimony, we've decided to conduct a full review of the entire department's practices. What happened to you is unacceptable, and we won't let it slide. Chris took the card, looking at the detective carefully. I didn't speak up for recognition or praise. I did it because it was the right thing to do. If you're really going to do something about this, then make sure it counts. I will, Detective Harris promised, his voice resolute. You've shown more courage than anyone could have expected. We'll make sure your fight doesn't end here. As the detective walked away, Emily placed a hand on Chris's shoulder. Do you think they'll really change things? Chris paused, thinking about the long road ahead. I don't know, but if I can change one thing today, if I can make someone think twice before they judge someone based on their appearance, then I've done what I set out to do. The sound of footsteps approached again, but this time, it was someone Chris hadn't expected. The courtroom doors opened, and a familiar face stepped inside, a man in a well-tailored suit, walking confidently toward Chris. Chris Dawson, the man asked, extending his hand. Yes, Chris replied, still unsure of who he was. The man smiled warmly. I'm David Carter, CEO of Carter Industries. I've been following your case and I want to talk to you about an opportunity. We need people like you, people who aren't afraid to stand up for what's right, even when the odds are against them. Chris raised an eyebrow. Opportunity. I'm just a guy trying to get justice. David's smile widened. Exactly. That's why I think you could be a great fit. You've got the kind of strength and resolve we need in leadership. How would you like to join us? Help lead the change from the inside. Chris was taken aback. He had been fighting for justice, for respect, for equality, never expecting anything in return. But here was an offer, an unexpected twist that made him reconsider the future. I'm not interested in titles or power, Chris said after a pause. I'm interested in making sure people like me, people who've been overlooked and underestimated, get a chance to speak up. David nodded, understanding in his eyes. That's exactly why I want you on board. We need leaders who think like you, people who understand the importance of real change, not just a position on a board. We're changing the game, Chris. I'd be honored if you would consider working with us. Chris looked at Emily, who gave him a knowing glance. This was unexpected, but it felt right. The wheels of change were turning, and this could be a chance to have a bigger impact on the world, on the system, on the people who needed a voice. I'll think about it, Chris said, his tone firm. But my fight is far from over. I'll always stand for what's right, no matter where that leads. David smiled again. Take your time. But know that we could use someone like you on our side. As David left, Chris and Emily shared a quiet moment. The world outside seemed a little brighter, the weight of the battle still heavy, but somehow a little lighter now. Chris had set out for justice, but now he realized that his journey was taking him somewhere much bigger, somewhere he had never imagined. The battle for fairness was far from over, But Chris Dawson had already become a force for change. The courtroom doors closed behind them as they walked into the world beyond, and Chris knew that this was just the beginning.